欢迎 Mr. Alex welcome the stage to make a speech for the U.S. corn harvest quality. Welcome, Mr. Alex.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to everybody in attendance for taking the time to be with us today. As Michael mentioned, we will be presenting our 14th annual corn harvest quality report that the U.S. Grains Council has conducted. So essentially, this is a report that we do where we evaluate the trends and factors that impact corn quality that go into FGIS grading factors, as well as additional factors such as moisture. And this is something that we look to do once a year at harvest. So this report came out in late November of 2024. And then in the middle of March of this year, we will be conducting our second report, the U.S. Corn Export Cargo Report. So it goes into the same factors, however, looking at it right before it's shipped out. So this will be essentially what we have at the point of harvest today. And then in March, we'll see where it is essentially right before it gets on the vessels. And as we mentioned, we test for a variety of factors. Next slide. Thank you. So then we'll look at the set of factors. We look at graded factors such as test weight, broken corn foreign material, total damage and heat damage, physical factors such as stress crack, 100 kernel weight, kernel volume, and other forms, as well as chemical composition, protein, starch, and oil, as well as mycotoxins. For the sake of time, we won't cover all of them, but you will see the majority of them. And the full report is on our website for those that do have additional questions. So as we mentioned, it's certainly been a productive year for the U.S. corn industry. What we found is that the weather plays a large role, and that's the case every year. That plays a large role in the planting process, growing conditions, and development. And we did find that the 2024 season was really impacted by early rains and moderate temperatures that mitigated throughout the best season. When we look at this chart here, we'll see that the planting was similar to the 5-year average, despite some interruptions from rain. And then we also saw that as a result of this, the ample moisture and warm conditions fostered quick emergence and strong growth. While at the silking stage, we saw that pollination initiated a little bit earlier, and then at the harvest was warm and dry conditions that led to quick field driving and timely harvest. This is very important because when there's less artificial drying, you'll see less risk of broken corn and foreign materials. You'll also see higher test weight and higher percentage of whole kernels while having lower moisture. We also saw that there was low crop stress and mild conditions were conducive to proper grain development. So when we look at this year's crop, we took 620 samples throughout the Corn Belt for this report. So we did make sure that it was a very equal and well-distributed sample conduction. We saw that 67% of the crop rated as good or excellent, and we saw at the time the highest yields on record. We do know that the last WASDE adjusted this a little bit. And then we also saw that harvest was 81% complete as of late October, which was up from 2023, as well as the 5-year average. And when we look at the crop rated good or excellent, this was up quite a bit from the 5-year average, and even last year was about 63%. And when we look ahead, you'll see that the test weight was higher, lower BCFM, and lower damage, and then lower moisture. So you see this is all conducive to more durable grain of higher quality. And then we also see higher starch levels, and protein was very similar, as well as stress cracks were among a similar amount. We were very pleased to see that 98.9% of samples were below the FDA action levels for aflatoxin. And this was a similar amount for DON, or vomitoxin, and 97.2% reached the same amount for fumonisin. So we have a little chart here on the production and yield. So the production that we saw at the time of publication of the report was 38.4 million metric tons. This was scheduled to be the third highest production year on record. We do understand that some issues on the back end of the growing season allowed for this, along with the yield, to be adjusted a little bit. We're happy to go into more detail later in the discussion. And then we see the same with our yields. This was scheduled to actually break last year's record of being the highest, and still the highest in the history of this report. However, the 11.49 metric tons was adjusted a little bit, similar reasons. But it's still important that we want to mention this because at the time that this report was published, these were the numbers that we were seeing, and we did find that the samples that we conducted the analysis on had very similar numbers regardless of what the yield projections were. Now we'll get into more of the detail of the report. We're going to start with grade factors and moisture. So as many of you are familiar, the U.S. marketing system has the FGIS system that goes into grades. You'll see there's 5, U.S. number 1, number 2, 3, 4, and 5. And these are conducted based off of essentially maximum allowed amounts of certain indicators. For example, moisture, broken corn foreign material, or test weight. Typically, what you'll see in the marketing system is that purchasers will contract on US number 2 or US number 3 US corn. And these grading factors are important that essentially buyers should contract based on the quality requirements that they need, as well as non-grade factors such as moisture. And then the final corn quality is also impacted by various movements within the US grain marketing system. So it's important to keep that in mind as contracts develop. And then when we look ahead, what we saw is that 89.2% of samples that we had qualified as US number 1 corn. This is the highest amount that it can be, the highest grade, and this was an increase of 1.2% compared to the same report in 2023. And when we look towards US number 2 corn, again, one of the more commonly contracted specifications, 96.2% qualified as US number 2 yellow corn. And the average aggregate quality of the samples tested was better than all grade factor requirements for US number 1. And now we're going to look ahead towards our test weight. We had the highest average in the history of the report of 75.8 kilograms per hectoliter. This was higher than the 5-year average, and 97.1% qualified as US number 1 corn, an increase from 93.7% in 2023. So the way we separate this report, and it's important to mention, is that we don't do so by state. So while we do take samples from for internal elevators throughout the U.S. Corn Belt, when we do this report, we separate it based off export catchment area. So you see there are 3. The one in green is the Gulf, so that's essentially what will theoretically be shipped through the Gulf of Mexico. The Southern Rail tends to go towards Mexico, and then the Pacific Northwest is in light blue. While it's not always confined to one state, this helps give our customers an idea essentially of what corn they would be more than likely to receive or based on their contracting habits. So in the case of this market, I know primarily you'll see a lot of Pacific Northwest. We saw there was a 75.1 kilogram per hectoliter test weight coming out of that region. And we're certainly happy to see that see these numbers. We found that this is indicative of mature corn and proper grain filling. So we think that this was really productive. As you see, it was a very high increase compared to 2023 even. And then when we look at broken corn foreign materials, it's certainly something that we know is an issue that we hear about quite a bit. At the time of harvest, we saw the aggregate of 0.6%. It is lower than the 5-year average, and about 98.3 would qualify as the number 1 grade. And we'll go into more detail later, and certainly happy to answer any questions on broken corn management. When we look at this, broken corn foreign material is primarily broken corn. About 80% of what you'll see this statistic is broken corn. And the reason why we saw less was that there was less of a need for artificial drying, which helps essentially, or which is less conducive to strong kernels. And it's essentially something that we know that throughout the export channel there's increased risk, but also U.S. corn, by being a softer endosperm corn, does have a higher susceptibility. And we'll look ahead towards total damage and heat damage, which was at 1.1%, lower than the 5-year average. You'll primarily see heat damage at the end of the export channel, but it's always important to mention this. We also found that because there was a more mature corn and higher durability, total damage was a little bit lower. we found that heat damage was the same throughout. And when we talk about total heat or total damage, is essentially the percentage that are visually damaged, or could be from heat, frost, sprouting, or other formats. So we did find that it was a pretty solidly quality corn in that regard. Then when we'll look ahead towards moisture percentage, this was certainly a positive as we look through this report, that it was the lowest average on the 14-year report of the record. It was lower than the 5-year average, and this was something that it is not a grade factor, but it's important that buyers often consider this in their contracts. It's also an indicator for potential drying and has implications for storability and test weight. The weather during the growing season does impact yield, the yield and development of the grain, but harvest moisture is often influenced by the timing of the harvest and weather conditions. Fortunately, we did find that throughout the Corn Belt there was pretty favorable. We had rains at the right time, it was warmer at the right time, so this was allowing us to see these numbers that were more favorable. So we'll move ahead to chemical composition. This primarily talks about protein, starch, and oil, which are certainly of interest to end users such as yourselves. These are not grade factors, and these are usually not expected to change significantly during storage or transport of the grains. For the sake of essentially the work that we've been doing, we'll focus primarily on protein and starch. We can go ahead to the next slide. So protein, as I'm sure many are aware, is an important factor for poultry and livestock feeding, as it supplies essential sulfur-containing amino acids and helps improve feed conversion efficiency. Protein is essentially decreases with decreased available soil nitrogen, or in years with higher crop yields. So in this case, when we saw higher crop yields, protein was a little bit lower, but not by too much. In this case, it was the same as the 5-year average at 8.5%. And what you'll typically see is that there's an inverse relationship between protein and starch. So if you see protein lower, starch tends to be higher, and vice versa. And this brings us to starch, where we saw an aggregate of 72.2% of starch content. This was a small bit higher, 0.1% higher than the 5-year average. And the Gulf of Mexico ECA had the highest average starch. It was tied with the Pacific Northwest at 72.3%. Starch is very important for wet millers and dry grind ethanol manufacturers. Essentially, starch is the energy within the corn kernel. It's also the indicative of good kernel growing and filling conditions and moderate kernel densities. When we talk about starch, we can go into it in more detail if anyone has questions. But essentially, with U.S. corn, there's the starch content and then there's starch extractability. And that's where U.S. corn stands out, that while starch content is at 72%, you might be able to maximize at 68, 69, or 70% of starch extractability due to the nature and the composition of the kernel. We'll keep continuing here with the physical factors. These are, again, quality attributes that are not grade factors or chemical factors, but it does help give insight on the processing ability of the corn. It's various usage, as well as understanding how it will maintain in storage, or understanding the breakage and handling. So we'll go here and just kind of a quick recap. Next slide, please. So here we'll just do a quick refresher of the corn kernel. It's about 82% endosperm. As you see, there's the hard endosperm or the flowery endosperm. U.S. corn, for being dent corn, is more of a softer endosperm corn. So this has essentially a give and a take. The give being that it does break down easier. You're able to extract most of the nutrients and most of the value out of the kernel. However, it does leave you a little bit more susceptible to breakage. So when we talk about, for example, starch, because it's a softer endosperm corn, you're able to extract more of it without expanding so much or using so much energy. The main focus here when we talk about the composition are stress cracks, which are internal cracks within the hard endosperm. And again, the common cause of this is artificial drying. This is when it needs, when there's higher moisture, or if it's colder, you need to throw it into an artificial dryer at high temperatures. This will essentially impact the breakage susceptibility and some other factors as we look ahead towards essentially the durability. It can also impact the milling and alkaline cooking availability. It is more prevalent when the corn passes through the marketing chain, and the higher stress cracks that do tend to reduce starch yield in wet milling or reduce flake size when it comes to dry milling. This year we had 9.3%. This was similar to the 5-year average, but certainly lower than 2023, where we did have an anomaly case of very hot and dry temperatures in a very specific window of dates, which led to essentially much higher stress cracks than we anticipated at 19.2%. The percentage of samples with less than 10% stress cracks was 68.6%, which was higher than 2023, but lower than 2022. And when we look towards this, there was 9.2% stress cracks in the Pacific Northwest, so lower than what you would see in the Gulf, but a small bit higher than what you would see coming out of the Southern Rail. But typically the Southern Rail tends to have the lowest in this metric because it does come from usually warmer temperature areas within the Corn Belt. And when we look here towards the 100 kernel weight, this was the highest average in the history of the 14-year report at 33 or 36.66 grams. Again, this is a factor related to the test weight and the general kernel filling and good timing of our harvest. I know we're a little bit short on time, so I'll just go very quickly into our mycotoxins. Next slide, please. So mycotoxins, as we know, those are fungi that occur naturally in grains. It can, at certain levels, create sickness in humans or animals. There are 6 main ones that we tested for here: aflatoxin, DON or vomitoxin, fumonisin, ochratoxin, T2, and zearalenone. For the sake of essentially this audience, the 3 main mycotoxins you'll see are the first 3 mentioned: aflatoxin, DON, and fumonisin. So those are the ones that we will go over in more detail. So when we look at aflatoxin, we saw that the percentage with no detectable levels was about 91.7%, and 98.9% of these samples tested below the FDA action level of 20 parts per billion. So what we mean by these action levels is essentially the FDA has a ceiling. So if you see a sample or if you see a shipment with 20 parts per billion or more, it's simply not exported. So that's essentially, there's a control there. The growing season was very conducive to minimizing aflatoxin development in most areas. This is essentially because it happens when there's very hot temperatures, low precipitation, or general drought. This year we did, as a whole, get pretty lucky. There were no major droughts, or there were no conditions followed by high humidity. And we'll look ahead towards DON or vomitoxin. We saw that it was similar to 2023 and 2022. 93.9% of the samples that we received fell below 1.9 parts per million, and 98.9% of samples did not fall above the FDA action levels. This can essentially happen. The vomitoxin will tend to happen when there's delay in harvest or storage of high moisture corn. When you have a year with the lowest moisture levels on record, this is certainly not as conducive to development. And then when we look towards fumonisin, this tends to happen when there's prolonged periods of heavy rain and high relative humidity during the grain filling period, as well as moderate temperatures that range between 10 to 30 degrees Celsius with a lot of variation and general fluctuations. This year, 97.2% of samples fell below 5 parts per million. This was slightly lower than 2023 and 2022, but minimal differences. So before we close out, I will just give a couple of quick conclusions. Next slide, please. And this is essentially what we were hoping to have everybody go home with some certain notes on what we can talk about U.S. grain quality. We can see that on average, 2024 harvest samples were good, with 89.2% of samples grading number 1 or better, compared to 88% in 2023 and 81% in 2022. Additionally, the averages that we saw for test weight, 100 kernel weight, and kernel volume were some of the highest that we've seen in the history of the report. Certainly reflects the productive growing and harvesting conditions. BCFM and total damage were lower than the 5-year average. So that means we were seeing mature corn and durable corn while still not losing its advantages when we talk about starch content and starch extractability. And we saw that moisture tied 2012 for the lowest average in the history of the report. And additionally, the growing season was not conducive to mycotoxin development in most areas. So certainly something we came out with a lot of positives. I did want to thank you all again. Thank you, Michael, and the U.S. Grants Council Taiwan team for the time, and look forward to speaking with you all in more detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. 非常谢谢 Alex 为大家的演讲啊。美国玉米我们可以看到，去年收成的品质应该是过去5年看起来是最好的一次了哈。大家可以看到，包括这个破碎率也低，它其实将近90%都已经达到1级的那个品质啊，水分也是很低啊。希望说今年的这个品质能够符合大家的期